The title of my talk is Constraining Spin from Polarized Images of Black Holes. But as I said, this is really more of a talk that will describe the results very briefly of a paper that just came out on Archive, I think, slightly over 24 hours ago. And so this is the second in a sequence of papers where the authors, so myself, Andrew Schall, Alex Lipsaska, and Elliot Quadier, where we're looking at various signatures of polarization in black hole images or black hole movies and kind of trying to drill down and understand in a robust quantitative way what information we can learn about the black hole, about the accretion system from these polarimetric images. So just to kind of orient everyone, I know that you probably don't need to see this image again, but I'm talking about these kinds of images. These are images of black holes. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on this kind of wavy, wispy pattern that you see here. So precisely this wavy pattern is the mark of linear polarization. So it's the orientation that the electric field makes when it arrives at the Earth. And it turns out that this linear polarization pattern, this electric vector position angle, EVPA, tells us something about the structure of the magnetic field around the black hole. And so there's this really wonderful animation that was made to explain this, and I think that it will walk us through kind of what we're seeing. So the setup here is that we have a black hole, and it's surrounded by a relatively thick accretion disk, and that accretion disk comprises a bunch of hot plasma, and that hot plasma has magnetic fields in it. And what we will see when I play this animation is we will see light being emitted from the plasma with a particular orientation relative to the magnetic field, and the light will travel through space to the observer, to us here on Earth, or just slightly above Earth, and that image is on the right-hand side. And so I'm going to play that animation now. And so again, you see that there's this black hole surrounded by plasma. And let's say that we know that the magnetic fields take this particular orientation. There's kind of circularly wrapping around the black hole. So when the light is produced in the system, the little photons will be produced and streamed to the camera. And importantly, for synchrotron radiation, for the radiation we're seeing at these frequencies, the electric field will be oscillating perpendicular to the magnetic field. And so if we spin up the black hole, or if we twist up the magnetic field and look at this process again, then what we see is that the polarization pattern, this EVPA, also gets wound up. And again, the EVPA is perpendicular to the orientation of the magnetic field. And so, if you kind of blur out your eyes again, what you see is that this polarization pattern, this kind of swept out, twisty polarization pattern, is perhaps giving us information about how twisty or swept out the magnetic fields are in the source. Now, of course, the picture is a bit more complicated than what I just described. There are general relativistic effects, and there are plasma effects, and so on, and so on, and so on. But heuristically, this is the idea you should have in your mind, that the structure that we see, this wavy structure, in some way relates to the structure of the magnetic field in the source. And so to make things a bit more quantitative, here I'm just showing you the polarized images, or now a subsample of the polarized images that we've produced with the Event Horizon Telescope experiment. And so here on the left, I'm showing you the panels for the M87 black hole and the black hole of the center of our galaxy, Sagittarius star, which we're all very familiar with. And again, just quantitatively marking the orientation of the electric field across the image, which it allows us to actually make, again, quantitative measurements in contrast to that wavy picture before. And the way that we make all this quantitatively precise, the way that we actually measure things, is to do a kind of Fourier decomposition of this polarization pattern across image azimuth. And so in particular, we're going to focus on the m=2 mode here, which is just picking out the rotationally symmetric structure in this EVPA across the image. And the way that you can think about this simply is just, if the EVPA pattern is perfectly radial, then it makes a pattern, I guess, that is zero with respect to radial. And as you change how twisty the polarization pattern is, you change the angle that the tick marks are making with respect to this kind of radial reference, going between zero or purely azimuthal, 180 degrees, or kind of twisted in one way or another, 90 degrees or plus or minus 90 degrees. And so the question that we want to answer here is there a way to quantitatively robustly connect this signature of polarization, for example, this quantitative beta 2 measure, to the black hole parameters, and in particular to the spin of the black hole? So Alejo gave a really excellent explanation of kind of why we might be interested in black hole spin. And of course, I'm sure that you're all aware of this anyway. But again, the name of the game, or the question that we want to answer, is there a way to connect the polarization quantitatively that we measure to something like black hole spin? So why might we think that we can do this? Well, part of our intuition comes from comparing kind of as close as you can get to analytic models of the magnetosphere. In other words, as close as you can get to analytic models of how the magnetic field is wound up around the black hole, comparing those analytic predictions to numerical simulations. And so we'll make this more precise on the next slide. But one thing that is, I think, particularly striking in this slide, in this comparison, is that the image on the left, which is a rendering of the gas density in some accretion disk, you're seeing that in the yellows and the blues and the greens, and the magnetic field structure, that looks incredibly similar to this analytic prediction that you can write down, this analytic solution to Maxwell's equations in the background of general relativity that was solved back in the 1970s by Blanford and Zanayak in their split monopole model. And so, right, in some sense, the model on the right is incredibly simple because all that it has in it is just the Maxwell equations that we're all familiar with and the influence of the black hole, so general relativity. And from these very, very simple input parameters, we get a solution to the magnetic field. We get a geometry to the magnetic field that looks incredibly, incredibly similar to numerical simulations. And so, if this very simple model on the right is kind of representative of the numerical simulations, then that gives us hope that perhaps, this, by tuning the parameters of the simple model, we can learn something about the more complicated model. So, okay, this is great. This is hopefully promising, but of course there are differences between the very simple model and the more complicated numerical simulation. And so the idea that we had in our paper that I'm talking about now is to just introduce a bit of extra complexity. And so the goal now is to understand how introducing some fluid inertia, how introducing plasma, introducing electrons and ions affects the structure of the magnetic field. And so we make a few simple assumptions. We assume that the system is in steady state, so it's not changing with time. We assume that it's axisymmetric. And we also confine all of the dynamics to lie within the midplane. And so if you make all of these assumptions, then the input parameters for your model are the black hole spin, which is good because you want to understand the relationship with black hole spin. Also the relative strength of the magnetic field, or put another way, kind of how important the plasma is, how important the gas is relative to the magnetic field, and also the outer boundary of your flow, so its location and its velocity. And when you solve for this model, this is solving the equation of GRMHD. There's this incredibly rich structure. I don't have time to go into all the details of it. If you're interested, please look at the paper. But broadly, there are two main takeaways, which is that increasing the fluid contribution affects both the velocity of the fluid, or the velocity of the material, which is unsurprising, and also the structure of the magnetic field. So to be precise, if I increase the contribution of the fluid inertia, so I decrease the relative importance of the magnetic field, then the fluid angular velocity increases. And that's what you're looking at here in the center of the right panels. As I go to more blue colors, the angular velocity of the fluid increases. And then also, as I increase the importance of the fluid, the field winding ratio, something like the B phi component over BR, in other words, how wound up the field is, that also increases. And so that's what you're looking at here on the bottom right. And so, okay, this is great. So we have now a simple analytic model for kind of what's going on, or semi-analytic model for how increasing the importance of the fluid changes the field structure. And so it's worthwhile to then ask, how does this model actually compare to simulations or to the data? And so the way that we make this comparison is, again, to look at the images that are produced either from a numerical simulation or from the semi-analytic model. And we measure the structure of the polarization. We measure the angle of the polarization as a function of radius in the image. And this is, I'll come back to this in the connection to Beck's. But we're talking about a resolved polarized measurement as a function of radius in the image. And so we can measure, we can ask how radial, how azimuthal is the EVPA as we walk across a radius in the image. And that's what I'm showing you here in that blue curve on the right. And what we want to do is we want to say, okay, one, can we predict the shape of that curve? And moreover, is there a signature in the shape of that curve that trends with the spin of the black hole? And so if I just make that direct comparison, the answer is yes. So on the right here, what I'm doing is I'm looking at different realizations of this semi-analytic inflow model, this very simplified 4-parameter inflow model, and I'm varying things like I'm varying what is my outer boundary, or I'm varying things like how important is the fluid, and then I process that model through an imaging framework, and I ask, okay, if this is my boundary condition, and this is my importance of the fluid, and I make an image of it, what structure do I expect to see in polarization as a function of image radius? And strikingly, what you'll notice is that if I change the spin of the black hole in this model, I end up with I end up lying within a distinct band in the polarization. And so if there's a low spinning black hole, a slowly spinning black hole, then this polarimetric structure will lie closer to minus 180 degrees. And then as I spin up the black hole, this polarimetric structure, again, resolved in radius, will go closer and closer towards zero, so closer and closer toward radial. Again, there's a whole bunch of really beautiful, interesting structure here. I don't have time to talk about it, but if you're interested, look into the paper. The last plots that I will just show is kind of what happens if you very naively and in a kind of brute force way apply the predictions of this model to the observations, or contrast the predictions of this model to the observations that we already have with the EHT. So this is a relatively complicated or busy plot, but I think it's not necessarily too complicated. What I'm showing you here in each of these panels, just showing M87 on the left or Sagittarius star on the right, is the prediction of this simple semi-analytic inflow model in this blue band. And again, as you increase the spin, the prediction of the inflow model shows that in some image integrated way, the polarization becomes more and more radial. I'm also contrasting that with the numerical simulations. So if you run numerical GRMHD, you get these kind of black KDEs, and there's good agreement between the inflow model and the GRMHD. And then you can just naively directly compare, from the 2017 observations of Sagittarius A star, we see an observed measurement of what the polarization angle should be. It's somewhere negative between, let's say, minus 90 and minus 180. I've gotten those numbers wrong in detail, but it's in the lower half. And then you can ask, okay, so which spins is that band consistent with? And what you find is that the spins that it's consistent with are relatively low, which is perhaps unsurprising. You can play the same game, of course, with M87, but in general, we should be careful. We don't necessarily understand all the details about how the signal varies with time. Again, remember that the inflow model, we assumed a kind of steady state, and also there can be Faraday rotation effects. So as the signal propagates from its source to the observer, or to our telescopes or to Beck's, then in principle it can be rotated. Okay, so anyway, this was my attempted very brief and hopefully comprehensible summary of this paper. I'll just say, polarimetric black hole images provide detailed information about the geometry of the magnetic field, and the geometry of the magnetic field is determined by some boundary condition at the event horizon, but also by what's going on in the plasma at larger radii. We've introduced a model that kind of explains how these two competing effects, the general relativity at the event horizon and the accretion structure at larger radii, ultimately control this net polarized signature. And we would argue that this model provides a quantitative understanding of polarized patterns and even enables constraints on spin. But my little Beck's plug here now is that, as you saw, there's this really rich structure in image radius. And so, more resolution will help us really, really nail all of these things down. Okay, so with that, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Thanks a lot, George. This is a very interesting work. Any questions? Oh, Alejandro?
Thank you, George. Can you go to your slide 10?
Yes.
Is there a way to understand why all these curves, even for the spin, they ended up almost at the same size? Like even like when the spin is 0.9 or something like that. Like even Schwarzschild or like the low spin ones are actually ended up. Is there a way to understand that
So
limit?
are you asking about on the left-hand side? So you're saying that they all go to approximately the same
Sorry,
point,
this,
or?
like yeah, like kind of. It's not the same point, but maybe here, yeah. Can you
Yeah,
see what?
so this is the subject of another paper in the series, but I I don't know, Alex, am I allowed to say what we know so far?
Yeah,
Or?
sure.
Okay. Yeah. So it turns out that the structure of the Faraday tensor, so the structure of the electromagnetic field, has to take on a certain value at the event horizon, and this is just a consequence of regularity. So the magnetic field has to be finite for any observer that falls through the event horizon. And so this, coupled with the fact that when you get close to the event horizon, space-time becomes weird, means that the polarization, when you reconstruct what the polarization is doing, the polarization, which you can ultimately construct the orientation as perpendicular to three directions. So perpendicular to the fluid velocity, the photon wave vector, and the magnetic field. It's kind of confined to lie within a certain geometric plane in some sense. And it ends up just being effectively the consequence of all of these geometric effects together. Now, the details of exactly how you get the number that you get, and the details of why there seems to be an apparent flip from negative to positive are currently the subject of active research. But stay tuned for those details later. It's an excellent question because it's a super cool signature. And again, if we have Bex, if we can do all of this really, really resolved polarimetry, we can exactly see that, right? The bands become incredibly narrow as you go to smaller image radii. And so, the predictions are very, very precise and maybe a way to concretely measure what's going on, concretely see signatures of general relativity.
Thank you.
One more question, maybe Daniel?
Sure. Yeah, George, how cool I think this whole project is, and I could pick your brain about it for hours. I guess I have a more specific questions. I remember back in our 2020 paper, we saw that the retrograde distributions tend to sort of squish towards large negative beta 2 phases, and I think there's a similar thing in the 2023 paper you and Andrew and Alex and I think Elliot, if memory serves, wrote the first one in the series. So I'm
Yes.
curious, does the analytic model have a coherent story for the retrograde accreting picture? Is that straightforward to predict? And do you see the same squishing?
Excellent question. The short answer is no. So part of the way that we impose the boundary condition is to enforce that the outer boundary condition is to enforce that the field line rotation rate matches the fluid rotation rate. And so that is just fundamentally incompatible with retrograde accretion. So unfortunately, it's an excellent question. This does not answer it. This model does not answer your question, cannot answer your question by construction.
I see. I guess it's notable as a case where something you would hope is truly generic is facing friction with something we know can be constructed by nature, and so it's anyway, more later. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely.